somewhere in the vegetable gardens of the Berghof, high in the Bavarian Alps above the village of Berchtesgaden, a gardener tends his rows. It is the spring of 1943. The potatoes are coming in well. The carrots are straight and uniform. The man is careful, methodical, particular about his work, as he has always been about everything. Adolf Hitler, the most powerful man in Europe, a man who has bent nations to his will, who has redrawn the map of an entire continent by force of arms and sheer malevolent conviction, does not eat meat. He does not drink alcohol, or not much. He is obsessive about his health, terrified of disease, suspicious of those who prepare his food. His personal cook, Constanze Manziali, prepares his meals with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremony. Every ingredient is checked, scrutinized, approved. Nothing enters his body without an unbroken chain of trusted hands. And yet, on the other side of the English Channel, in offices that did not officially exist, staffed by men and women who were never quite what they appeared to be, a group of British intelligence operatives were turning this obsession against him. They were going to poison the Führer, not to kill him. That was not the plan. They were going to change him, slowly, chemically, invisibly. They were going to make Adolf Hitler a woman. The story of what the Special Operations Executives Research Division, working in close concert with Britain's scientific establishment, actually proposed to do to the Nazi dictator, is one of the most extraordinary footnotes of the Second World War. It is simultaneously absurd and coldly rational, farcical in conception, and genuinely sophisticated in its scientific understanding. It speaks to the desperation of a nation fighting for its survival, to the creative extremity that total war produces in clever people under pressure, and to something deeply, peculiarly British. The belief that there is always, somewhere, a more cunning way. This is that story. To understand why British intelligence was willing to consider something this outlandish, it is necessary to understand what the war looked like in the middle years of the conflict. By 1943, the tide was turning. Stalingrad had been a catastrophe for Germany. The North African campaign was grinding toward its conclusion, but the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. The Soviet Union was bleeding at a rate that staggered the imagination. Estimates would later suggest some 27 million Soviet dead before the war's end. Britain had survived the Blitz, but survival is not the same as victory. The prospect of a war that might last until 1946, 1947, or beyond was not a fantasy. It was a serious planning assumption. In this context, British intelligence had been exploring unconventional methods of degrading enemy effectiveness since at least 1940. The Special Operations Executive, established by Winston Churchill in July of that year with his famous instruction to set Europe ablaze, was tasked with sabotage, subversion, and the kind of irregular warfare that conventional military establishments regarded with barely concealed distaste. The SOE's various research sections were consequently asked to think without limits. They explored exploding rats, incendiary bats, a device designed to be inserted into a German lavatory, with results that imagination might supply, and a compound intended to make the beards of enemy agents grow at an accelerated rate, on the theory that a man who must shave 3 times a day is a man who cannot concentrate on espionage. Against this backdrop, the proposal to administer estrogen to Adolf Hitler was not, by SOE standards, particularly shocking. It was, however, unusually well grounded in genuine science. The specific proposal, and it is important to be precise here because the historical record on this point is clearer than skeptics sometimes suggest, was to introduce female sex hormones, specifically estrogen, into Hitler's food supply. The target was his private vegetable garden at the Berghof. The mechanism was straightforward in theory. Estrogen could be dissolved into certain vegetables without significantly altering their taste or appearance. It would be invisible to any inspection. And because the effects of estrogen on a male body accumulate gradually over time, rather than producing any dramatic sudden change, neither Hitler himself nor his food tasters would notice anything amiss during the administration period. The scientific reasoning behind the proposal was grounded in research that was, for its era, genuinely sophisticated. By the early 1940s, the biological effects of estrogen on male physiology were reasonably well understood within the research community, even if the full complexity of endocrinology lay decades in the future. British scientists, including some attached to the Chemical Defence Experimental Establishment at Porton Down in Wiltshire, had been investigating the properties of synthetic hormones. Oestrogen had already been explored as a treatment for prostate cancer, with the understanding that it could suppress testosterone and thereby reduce the aggressive cellular growth associated with that condition. This suppressive effect on testosterone was, from the perspective of SOE planners, the key. The logic ran something like this. Testosterone was understood to be associated with aggression, with drive, with the kind of domineering leadership style that Hitler exemplified in almost parodic form. Estrogen, by contrast, was associated with what the researchers characterized as moods and personality traits more common to women: greater emotionality, reduced aggression, a softening of what might be called combative certainty. If Hitler could be slowly, secretly feminized, his rages might diminish, his certainty might waver. His generals, who by 1943 were regularly experiencing the consequences of his refusal to accept military advice, might find a more tractable commander-in-chief. The course of the war might conceivably be altered, not through any single dramatic action, but through the slow chemistry of a changed personality. The estrogen itself was proposed to be introduced through vegetables that Hitler was known to consume regularly. Carrots were specifically mentioned in accounts that have surfaced in the decades since the war. The compound would be dissolved and absorbed into the vegetable structure during its growing phase, making it biochemically inseparable from the food itself, and therefore undetectable by any means available to German security services in the 1940s. There would be no foreign substance to find, no residue to identify. There would simply be a changed man. The SOE researchers who developed this proposal were not naive about its limitations. They understood that any hormonal effect would take months to manifest meaningfully. They understood that the chain of access required to actually reach Hitler's gardens was formidable. The Berghof was one of the most heavily guarded private residences in Europe, and the inner circle of staff who worked there had been vetted with extraordinary thoroughness. They understood that the effect, even if successfully administered, would be uncertain in its magnitude and unpredictable in its precise character. Different men respond to estrogen differently. There was no reliable way to calibrate a dose through vegetable matter to produce a specific psychological outcome. And yet they believed it was worth pursuing, because in the mathematics of total war, Even a marginal improvement in Allied fortunes was worth an almost unlimited investment of ingenuity. If there was one chance in 50 that Hitler's judgment might be subtly compromised, that chance was worth taking. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Berghof itself presented the planners with a challenge that went well beyond the biochemical. Hitler's mountain retreat, perched above the Obersalzberg plateau with views across to the Austrian Alps, was not simply a private home. It was a fortified complex, ringed by SS guards, surrounded by the residences of other senior Nazi officials. Göring's house was within sight of the Führer's own terrace, and connected to a network of tunnels and bunkers whose full extent was not known to Allied intelligence. Access to the gardens required penetrating not one, but several layers of security. The staff who worked there were known by name, by face, by family history. The SOE had, by this period of the war, placed agents in extraordinary positions across occupied Europe. Its networks in France, Norway, Denmark, and elsewhere had achieved genuine operational impact. But the inner sanctum of the Berghof was another order of difficulty. There is no documented evidence that the estrogen proposal ever progressed to the point of actual deployment, to an agent in position, to a compromised member of Hitler's household staff, to a successful introduction of the compound into the gardens. The proposal appears to have remained at the planning and research stage, a serious option that was seriously evaluated and ultimately set aside, either because the access problem proved insurmountable, or because, as the war's trajectory shifted after 1943, the calculation of risk and reward changed. What is documented is that the research underpinning the proposal was real. British scientists did investigate the practicality of introducing estrogen into a food supply. The compound's properties were understood. The vegetable absorption method was considered technically feasible. The proposal was not fantasy. It was a genuine intelligence operation that did not, in the end, reach execution. The German side of the ledger presents an interesting contrast. Nazi Germany's biological and chemical warfare research was extensive, lavishly funded, and in some respects, technically advanced. The programs at institutes, such as the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, explored a range of offensive and defensive applications for chemical and biological agents. German intelligence services, the Abwehr, and later the SD certainly explored assassination as a tool, and there were German proposals for operations against Allied leadership that bear some resemblance in concept, if not in specific mechanism, to what the SOE was contemplating. What German intelligence did not appear to pursue, at least in any documented form, was the specific use of hormonal compounds for personality modification in enemy leadership. This reflects a broader difference in approach. British special operations thinking, particularly in the SOE, had an improvisational quality, a willingness to consider the genuinely bizarre alongside the conventionally dangerous. That was partly a function of the organization's civilian roots. The SOE drew heavily on academics, businessmen, lawyers, writers, people who had not spent their professional lives inside military or intelligence orthodoxy. This produced, alongside genuine operational genius, a kind of institutional permission to think the unthinkable. American intelligence, particularly the Office of Strategic Services, established in 1942 under William Donovan, engaged in its own share of unconventional research. OSS files, declassified in later decades, revealed proposals of comparable imagination. Attempts to dust Hitler's food with a compound that would cause his mustache to fall out, thereby destroying his iconic appearance, were among them. The Americans were, in some respects, working from a similar playbook, though with rather more resources and rather less of the particular eccentric British confidence that the most peculiar ideas are often the best ones. The actual historical impact of the estrogen proposal is, by the nature of an operation that never reached execution, difficult to assess in material terms. What it achieved was no physical change in Adolf Hitler's physiology. His hormones remained his own. His rages continued. His refusal to accept military reality accelerated, if anything, in the final years of the war. No British intelligence operation of the estrogen variety or any other is recorded as having directly altered his behavior. And yet the proposal matters, as history, for several reasons that go beyond its immediate practical outcome. It tells us something important about the range of thinking that total war produces in intelligent people under pressure. It illustrates the degree to which the Second World War was a war of science as much as a war of armies, a conflict in which the chemistry laboratory and the code-breaking hut were as strategically significant as the tank factory and the aircraft assembly line. The willingness to consider estrogen as a weapon speaks to a scientific confidence in the early 1940s that biological processes could be manipulated at the level of individual human behavior, a confidence that, in the decades since, has been both vindicated and complicated by advances in endocrinology and neuroscience. The proposal also speaks to a specific British strategic instinct that runs like a thread through the Second World War. The preference, wherever possible, for the indirect approach. Rather than confronting German power head-on in circumstances that favored German strength, British strategy consistently sought to find the angles, the flanks, the unexpected vulnerabilities. It was an instinct born partly of necessity. Britain was, for most of the war, fighting with resources that were never going to match Germany's in direct exchange, and partly of tradition. The nation that had built an empire through commercial cunning, diplomatic manipulation, and strategic partnership rather than purely through military force, brought those habits of mind to bear on a conflict that demanded something more than conventional military virtue. The estrogen plan was, in its way, the intellectual expression of that tradition. Audacious, peculiar, scientifically grounded, operationally impractical, and irreducibly, unmistakably British. For those interested in the physical traces of this history, the Berghof itself no longer exists. American forces bombed it on April 25, 1945, and what survived was demolished by the Bavarian state government in 1952, partly to prevent it becoming a site of pilgrimage for neo-Nazis. The gardens where Hitler's carrots grew, the soil into which British planners once imagined dissolving the chemical agent of his transformation, have long since been reclaimed by the mountainside. Porton Down, by contrast, continues its work to this day. Its research portfolio expanded far beyond anything the wartime scientists could have imagined, though its culture of classified inquiry would not be entirely unfamiliar to those who worked there 80 years ago. Return then to that Bavarian hillside in 1943, the carrots growing in their rows, the most dangerous man in Europe moving between his daily rituals, the military briefings, the long afternoon teas, the evenings of Wagner and monologue. In London, men and women whose names were not known are sitting in rooms that did not officially exist, looking at scientific reports, weighing the properties of hormonal compounds, calculating the improbable geometry of access and dosage and effect. They are trying, in the way that desperate and clever people in impossible circumstances always try, to find the angle that changes everything, the unexpected vector, the attack that comes from the direction the enemy has not thought to defend. They know, most of them, that this particular attack will likely never reach its target. The garden is too well guarded. The chain of access is too long and too fragile. The science is right, but the operation is beyond reach. And yet they persist in the thinking, because in war, as in all human extremity, the failure to imagine is the most dangerous failure of all. The plan that seemed absurd became a plan that was considered. The compound that seemed irrelevant became a weapon. The carrots in the Führer's garden became, for a brief period in the history of the most destructive conflict humanity had yet produced, a potential instrument of strategic transformation. They did not use it. They could not use it, but they thought of it, planned it, tested it in the laboratory, and wrote it down. Which is how we know about it now, in the files of declassified intelligence history, in the accounts of SOE researchers, whose work only became visible after the secrecy of decades was slowly lifted. Adolf Hitler died by his own hand on the 30th of April 1945, in a bunker beneath the rubble of Berlin. His ideology was defeated, his regime destroyed, his armies scattered and surrendered. He was changed not by British chemistry, but by the accumulated weight of military catastrophe and his own catastrophic misjudgments. But somewhere in the margins of that history, in the declassified files, in the footnotes, in the peculiar tradition of a nation that once considered dissolving hormones into a dictator's vegetables, there is a reminder of something important, that when survival is at stake, the human imagination will go anywhere, that the most unlikely weapon is sometimes the one that gets the most serious attention, and that the British, at their most characteristically British, will look at the most powerful man in the world and ask with complete seriousness, what if we simply changed him? They didn't, but they thought about it, and in the long, strange history of the Second World War, the thinking itself was not nothing at all.